Welcome to another presentation of classic chess games. Today I'm going to bring you the game that was played at the Rosenwald Memorial Tournament, New York, 1956, October 17th. It was between Robert Byrne and Bobby Fischer. Robert Byrne was a longtime columnist and a chess master. He's also the brother to Donald Byrne, and his opponent is 13-year-old Robert James Fischer, who he later came to be known as Bobby Fischer, who was the 11th world champion. And at 13 years old, this is a very big win for him. A very exciting game. So let's get on to the game straight away here. This game was called the Game of the Century by Hans Kmoch in Chess Review in 1956. It was played between chess masters Donald Byrne and 13-year-old Bobby Fischer at the Rosenwald Memorial in New York, October 17th, 1956. The annotations to this, a lot of it comes from David Wheeler from Wikipedia, based on a number of sources, Graham Burgess being the primary one, and then some of Bobby Fischer's notes from magazines. But mostly I'm taking what they have done, did my own Fritz analysis on this, and their notes may be borrowed a little bit here, but I'm not going to be exactly using their notes. I'm going to be trying to narrate this for you from my perspective. Now, Donald Byrne was born in 1930, and he passed away in 1976, and Bobby Fischer was born in 1943, and he passed away in January of 2008. He eventually became the world champion. In this game, Fischer, playing black, plays a brilliant style, and Byrne, playing white, after a standard opening, makes a minor mistake on the 11th move, moving the same piece twice, as Burgess points out. Fischer pounces on him with strong sacrificial play, culminating in an incredible queen sacrifice on the 17th move. Byrne takes the queen, and Fischer compensates for this by taking many other pieces and using a windmill technique, which we'll look at. Okay, we start out with knight f3. Byrne does. Could be a reti opening. It's a non-committal move, and it can transpose into many things. A lot of people panic when they see this move, and you shouldn't. You should just have a setup that you play as black against the queen pawn, because it most often will transpose into that. But you can also possibly transpose it into some king pawns if you like to play the Sicilian or something like that. So it's nothing to worry about. Knight f6 would be my suggested reply, is what Bobby Fischer played. c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7. So we basically have an English opening at this point. Fischer's opted to play in a hypermodern style. He wants Byrne to build up a classical pawn center, and then he'll attack it from the wings. d4, so we're out of the English, we're back into a more standard queen pawn type opening. Now Fischer castle, and now bishop f4. Now Fischer now plays d5, and I have had a great success of playing the pawn up to d6 whenever this bishop is here, because I feel that that bishop's just out of place. True, in this line he could possibly play maybe his queen up to here with the idea of bringing the bishop down to here and doing a trade-off. He could do that in either case. So I kind of like the d6 setup, but Fischer switched often between d5 and d6 in these games. That he had equal loyalties both to Grunfeld and the King's Indian Defense. Now queen to b3. Now pawn takes, queen takes, c6, e4, knight b d7, 9, rook to d1, knight to b6, queen to c5. This is actually an awkward place for the queen. It'd probably be best to drop the queen back to b3, as shown here. Now Fischer played bishop to g4, pinning the knight. Now looking at this, you would have to say that White's position is quite okay. He has a bit of a lead in development. You know, he'll bring his bishop out to a good square and castle. But Fischer's king is quite safe. And actually he's not that far behind in development. He may be a little bit cramped, but he's not doing too bad. But the important thing is that White's king is still in the center. Byrne played bishop to g5, and this is a slight error. Here he moves the same piece twice, okay? But probably best is to play bishop e2 with the idea of getting castled if possible. And then knight f d7. Now you see the unfortunate situation of the queen. If she was on b3, that move wouldn't have that much effect. Queen a3, bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, now e5. With the idea if he captures, then you play queen to e8, and then say after bishop e2, knight takes e5, recovering the pawn with much freer play for the pieces for black. Black's got at least an equal game here. Now Fischer comes up with a really nice move, and knight to a4, and black's chances are equal at this point, already in the opening, and we're at move 11. So for a young 13-year-old to, you know, get an even position against a well-known master at move 11 is no easy thing to do. He offers up his knight, but if Byrne takes it with knight a4, then knight takes e4 is going to be quite dangerous. For example, if knight takes a4, knight takes e4, hitting the queen, and now White's got some choices. He's at some crossroads here. He could play, well, first let's take a look at bishop takes e7. Then we have knight takes c5. And if bishop takes d8, then knight takes a4. He needs to get his bishop out of town. Bishop takes f3, gf3, knight takes b2. Black is a pawn up, and White just has some miserably isolated pawns all over the board. The H, the doubled F, the D, and the A pawns are all weaklings. White has the bishop pair, but that will hardly compensate for the pawn deficit and the weak pawns. Okay, after knight takes e4, another shot by White might be queen c1, let's say. And then we simply go queen to a5 check. And now, if bishop d2, queen takes, and then bishop e2, black again is up a pawn, and White's position is not all that great. There's going to be trades. He's also got a weak, isolated d pawn here. So, this also favors black. Queen c1 doesn't quite work. How about queen to b4? Then we would have knight takes g5, knight takes g5, bishop takes d1, king takes d1, and now I think Burgess in his book, I'm not sure, I don't have the book in front of me, recommended bishop takes d4 with the idea of queen to d2, bishop takes f2. But probably a little more forcing line would be b5, knight to c5, bishop takes d4, hitting the knight. Now the knight drops back to protect that pawn on f2, and now a5. And all of a sudden, black's army is pushing white back. And white's got to be very careful. His king's still in the center. And what we have here is a trade of black traded 2 knights basically for a rook and 2 pawns. Black's got quite a considerable edge here. Okay, and perhaps the most obvious looking move would be queen takes e7 here. That runs into queen a5 check, b4, queen takes a4, queen takes e4. Now simply rook fe8 with the idea if he blocks with the bishop, then we take on f3, and then we play bishop to f8. And it's going to get this bishop back because of this pin here. And to top it off, all these pawns are still weaklings. This rook here is going to take a while to get into the game, and black's going to be able to get this open file under his own control. Black is winning here. So taking the knight on a4 doesn't seem like an option for white. Instead, Byrne plays queen to a3. And after knight takes c3, b takes c3, now knight takes e4. And this is a very sharp game. It's trading one thing for another. Now, the trades that are happening here are happening in the center. Well, let's play white's next move. He plays bishop takes e7. Now, the trades are happening in the center here, where the white king is sitting there exposed. So you may think they're even trades, but in reality they are greatly favoring black because of the exposed nature of white's king. And now Byrne decides to stay away from winning material because Fischer plays queen to b6, and here he could have tried bishop takes f8, but grabbing the material is really asking for trouble. After bishop takes f8, now queen to b3, then we have a really nice move, knight takes c3. I guess rook to e8 could be played, and after queen takes, well, excuse me, let's play bishop e2, then we have knight takes c3. And the point here is that the queen can't really capture because of this devastating pin here, winning the queen. So let's go look at queen takes queen, and now after pawn takes queen, now bishop e2, knight takes c3, rook to d2 seems like a defense. But now bishop to b4 comes in, and if he castles, he's going to just lose protection on this because it's hit. Excuse me. It's hit twice. So he can't castle. The king's still stuck in the center. So the whole play evolves around keeping the white king stuck in the center in all of these lines. So king f1, now knight to e4, hitting the rook twice, rook to b2, bishop to c3, rook to c2, now knight to d2 check, and now if knight takes d2, we have a really cute bishop takes e2 check, king goes back, bishop to d3 hitting the rook, and where does the rook go? He's got to protect against the mate, so his move is forced. And then after bishop takes d2, well, it's obvious that black is winning. He's got the two bishops for the rook, and white's got these weak pawns, and black has got this tower of strength over on the queen side. Plus, this rook over here is going to take an eternity to get into the game. It's not looking good at all for white here. So after knight to d2 check, there's king to g1, which allows for rook takes e2, rook takes c3, knight takes f3 check, g takes f3, and now bishop to h3. And the threat is mate, so that forces him to play rook to c1. Now rook takes a2, and though the material is equal, nominally, it's a bishop and two pawns versus a rook, how on earth is this rook here going to get out? It's going to take quite a bit of doing and some ingenuity. And this pawn is weak, these pawns are still weak in the endgame, and again, these pawns represent a tower of strength for black. So that was if black played rook to e8 here. But he can play knight takes c3 immediately, And the point is, if queen takes, then again we get this pin here, pinning and winning the queen. And if he trades queens, then we take here, and now the pawn is threatened on a2 twice, so he tries to defend it as best he can. Probably should look for something else and just jettison the pawn, but he goes here, thinking, well, if he trades, then I'm going to have chances in the endgame. But he doesn't trade. He goes rook to e8 check, and now king to d2 and knight to e4 check. And the reason is he has to move the king over to the queen side in more open territory than before. Because if he goes, let's say, king to e3, now bishop h6 is just really hard to deal with, because his only legal move here is, well, he can go to e2, but we'll discuss that in a moment. He can go to d3, knight takes f2. And he's forking the king and the rook, and that's going to win material. If he tries king to e2 here, coming closer, it doesn't help because it's simply knight to g3 check, king moves, and now you take the rook. And black is up in material, he's going to win this. So, like it or not, in this position here, white has to run to the queen side, say with king to c2. And then we get knight takes f2. So at this point, nominally the material is even. It's a bishop and two pawns versus the rook. And now to save the rook, he goes rook to g1, but now bishop f5 check, king to b2, rook to e3 penetrating, and this is also threatening to bring this bishop down here to come into the attack as well. And to stop this, white has to play a3. Now bishop g7, and there's just all sorts of pressure exerted on this pawn on d4. And now material's even, I'd have to say that black has a winning game here. White's king is terribly exposed. He's got weak pawns. Black's got the bishop pair and most of the control of the open board. So that's why back here, instead of taking the rook on f8, Byrne played bishop c4. And it took a while for Fritz to actually come around and realize this was the best move. I mean, this is a pretty complicated position, and it's worth a detailed analysis more than we can give in this video here. I'd encourage you to set this position up, or to get the printed version of this game, set it up on a board and work through all the different things that are there, because there's a lot of interesting tactical ideas that are available in this. And so if it took Fritz a couple minutes to come up with bishop c4 as being the best move, by I think it was by 4/10 or so over bishop to d3, it means that these guys were playing at a very high caliber way back in 1956, before there were any computer programs playing chess. So bishop c4 was played by Byrne. Now knight takes c3. And now you're thinking, well, why can't we just take the knight? Well, if queen takes c3, then we have the rook over to here, and it's pinning it. And if he castles now, rook takes e7, and then we get a game plan that looks like this for black. Black will work to control the open file. He'll have the pressure on the d-pawn. He could trade at any time on f3 to win the d-pawn. If white wants to trade rooks on e1, that means f2 is going to become a weakness. And if black ever takes on d5 with the bishop, that could be quite a problem. Now, black is a pawn up here as well, so we must bear that in mind. Black is doing very well. White has managed to castle, so this is probably the best that white could have hoped for out of this position. But it's not a very good hope. Okay, this is just really a miserable position for white to have to suffer through. So that's probably why instead of taking the knight, he played bishop c5. And now, well, Black gets in the obvious rook check, gets the rook out of being on pre, and delivers check, forcing the king to move. There's no piece that could interpose. Well, he could interpose on e5, but he's going to lose the whole boat. The rook on d1 would be hanging. There could be a trade on e5. Bishop takes e5. D takes e5. Rook takes e5 check. It loses material, so it's not even worth thinking about. King to f1 has to be played. And now bishop e6. This is a double exclamation mark. Now there was a possibility of playing knight to b5, but it's not really anything black should go for when he's got something better, because after bishop takes f7, king takes, queen to b3 check, bishop to e6, and now knight to g5 check. King to g8, knight takes g6, knight takes d4, hitting the queen. I mean, this is crazy, crazy stuff. This is why this game is so fun to set up on a board and just look at and go through the notes and look at it. Knight takes d4 with discovered check, and after queen takes queen, knight takes b3. All of a sudden, it's white who's up in material. White will have to untangle his position to get his king rook out, but he's going to eventually do it, and he's going to be winning after that. With that in mind, Fischer played bishop to e6. And it's such a beautiful move. This very clever move by Fischer is the move that made the game famous. Instead of trying to protect his queen, as in the last variation we saw, or trying some tactical means to protect her, Bobby comes up with a counterattack using his bishop and sacrifices his queen. And Byrne can't simply just take the bishop, as that leads to disaster. After bishop takes bishop, we get queen to b5 check, king to g1, and now we have a smothered mate. Knight to e2 check, king at f1, knight to g3 with double check, king to g1, and now queen to f1 check, rook takes, and then knight to e2 is checkmate. So we get to see a couple of tactical techniques here. The checkmate by smothered mate is one, and we'll see the windmill technique in just a moment. So after Fischer surprising bishop e6, he can't play bishop takes bishop. What if he tries taking the knight? Well, then we get a simple queen takes bishop, pawn takes, bishop takes queen. And here black is simply a pawn up, and white's pawns are in pretty rough shape. This rook is going to take a while to get out, and black's got the bishop pair. Of course, white could trade right now and stop that, but that's going to give black even more control over the open file if he does that. So it's looking pretty grim for white in this line. Another attempt for white after bishop to e6 is to play bishop to d3. But this comes into fire with knight to b5. Now, if bishop takes b6 and bishop takes queen, knight takes queen. Bishop to c5, getting the bishop out of fire. Knight to b5. And now if the trade happens here, this looks like it's a concession on black's part. But black is a pawn up. White still has these weak pawns. And though these pawns may look weak, they're actually pretty strong for black. And one of these, if not two of these pawns on the queen side, will become passed pawns. And with these bishops just bearing down the board, it's going to be very hard for white to put a stop to these pawns just flying up and doing their damage. So instead of playing bishop takes b6, white can try queen to b4. But simply after queen to c7, bishop takes b5, c takes b5, and now king to g1 and queen to c6, black is going to be okay. Actually, black is going to be winning, I'm sorry. Because, again, these pawns here are not a weakness, they're a strength. We still have these bishops barreling down the board here. White's still got this weak pawn on d4 and a2. You really have to like black's chances in this game. I think he's winning here. Oh, also should note that in this position you cannot really take this pawn. It would be nice to restore material equality, but if he plays queen takes b5, he runs into a nasty headache after b6. Because if the bishop retreats, then there's bishop c4 with check, snaring the queen. So perhaps Byrne was looking down the road a little bit in this, and he saw something would happen further, many moves down. And it's very hard to calculate all these moves. It's very difficult. And I'd like to have known what the time situation was on the clocks there for each player. But I feel reasonably sure that Bobby had seen this through. Maybe not all the way to the conclusion, not all the way to the mate, but all the way to regaining the material with the white king still being exposed. I'm sure he saw that far. Byrne, on the other hand, misjudged the position, and he did play bishop takes queen. Had he not played bishop takes queen, we wouldn't be talking about this game so much. And now, after bishop takes c5 check, Fischer now uses the power of the knight, the bishop, and the rook to regain some of the material he sacrificed. Remember, he gave up his queen, so far at this point, he's got a bishop and a pawn for the queen. Not a whole lot, but you'll see he gets more. Alright, king to g1 is forced, and now knight to e2 check, king to f1, and now knight takes d4 check. So now he's picked up 2 pawns and the bishop for the queen. Again, king to g1 is forced. I guess he could interpose with the queen, but that would be pointless. And now, knight to e2 check, king to f1, now knight to c3 with discovered check. And the point of this is now he's hitting this rook. He's preventing the queen from coming in any further beyond that because this bishop's protecting the knight. So he's basically cutting the board in two here. Everything on the left is well under black's control. Everything on the right is not in white's control. He's pretty much neutralized there. And even that section of the board is going to fall into black's hands in a moment. So king to g1 was played, and now pawn takes bishop, and this hits the queen. Now notice how all of Fischer's moves have been forcing. They've had a direct threat or a check associated with them. Now we have 2 bishops and 2 pawns for the queen, which, if we recall a presentation by Dennis Montecrucis, he said sometimes that's enough, and then it certainly is in this case. It's more than enough, because Fischer's still going to pick up more material. He's going to keep the white king on the run. Just those factors alone are going to say this is enough for the sacrifice. So we can consider that Fischer's queen sacrifice at this point has been a success. Now white plays queen to b4, and now Fischer comes up with a really nice move here. He plays rook to a4. Very nice. I think maybe Byrne, when he was accepting the queen sacrifice, looked at black playing knight takes d1, when after queen takes c4, white's still in hot water, but he might have some chances of playing g3, king g2, and get his king out of there and get his rook developed. Black's still winning, but it might be a chance for white to climb back into the game. But after rook takes a4, it's rather cold-blooded, and it just kills any hopes that white had. White plays queen takes b6. He picks up a pawn, but the queen is poorly posted on this square. Now, there's something interesting to look at here. White in this position took the pawn on b6, but let's just look at his options. He has d6 is probably the best place, but what if he goes to queen to b2? Then we got knight to here check. King comes up. Now we go discovered check. And white can choose to give up more material or king to g1, and then bishop takes queen. So queen to b2 doesn't work. And finally, what if he does play queen to d6, trying to get out, trying to get out of this mess? Then simply knight takes d1 is going to give black overwhelming material superiority, because white cannot take the knight, because after rook takes a2, black's threatening rook to a1, picking up the queen for the rook because of the pin, and there's no way to stop it. This is why Byrne played queen takes pawn on b6. Okay, now Fischer followed up with knight takes rook. So Fischer's got a rook and a couple of bishops and a pawn as compensation for the queen, and Fischer's gained significantly more material than he's lost. In addition, his Byrne's rook on h1 basically leaves black a rook ahead, and his king is still exposed too. So Fischer concludes this part of the game with great precision, in my opinion. Byrne played h3, and now probably rook takes rook takes a2, king to h2, knight takes f2. So he's got a rook, two bishops, and three pawns for the queen. That is a huge material superiority for black. The question is, can he coordinate his forces, or can white disrupt the coordination of black's forces in any significant way? And the answer is no, he cannot, and Fischer pulls his pieces together very nicely here in the game, and this is the most instructive part of the game, actually. You know, it's one of those how to win a one game type things. Byrne played rook to e1. I think that's just desperation. The trades obviously don't help him. Rook takes e1, queen d8, check, bishop to f8, knight takes e1, and now bishop to d5. Notice how black is going to be now using these forces together to hamstring the white king. Knight to f3, knight to e4, queen to b8, b5. And if Fischer didn't have any more than just these pawns would certainly be enough to win the game. But he has more. White played h4, h5, knight to e5, and now to king g7. Now, black is merely doing this to break the pin and to bring this bishop in along this diagonal somewhere to come into the attack, as we'll see later on. King to g1, bishop c5. And now Fischer uses his pieces to pry the king away from the king's side and away from the last bits of protection that he has, and he does this in a very nice way. King to f1, knight to g3, check. Notice how this rook is used to keep the king on the back rank, and he gradually controls the squares on the back rank with the pieces, forcing the king into a smaller and smaller box. King to e1, bishop to b4, check. Somebody, I think it was Kmoch, pointed out that there's a shorter mate with rook to e2 check. It's one move shorter. King to d1, bishop to b3 check. King to c1, bishop to a3 check. King to b1, and now rook to e1 is checkmate. It's one move shorter than Fischer's version. But interestingly, our old Silicon computer friend Fritz had another possibility for mate here, and that was bishop to f2 check, king to d1, bishop to b3 check, king to c1, knight to e2 check. It's interesting to see how all these different pieces can come together in a cohesive form to herd the king into a checkmate. King to b1, knight to c3 check, king to c1 the only move, and now bishop to e3 check. A totally different mate. Fischer played here bishop to b4 check, and there's nothing wrong with that. He saw this line, he figured he'd play it, and it's actually quite pretty how it ends. King goes over, and again, look how we're reducing the scope of the king. And the pieces work well together, protecting one another and forcing the king into the mating net. Alright, knight to e2 check was played, and now king to b1, and knight to c3 check, king to c1, and you could play bishop to a3 mate, but Fischer played rook to c2 checkmate. Rather pretty mate, and quite a rout in the later part of the game. And it was all going back to the queen sacrifice offer. At move 17, when Fischer put his queen on the chopping block, it's probably one of the most famous diagrammed positions in the history of chess, because Fischer was quite a commotion at 13 years old for winning such a game. And for many years after this, as Fischer rose in fame, this game became more and more prominent. At the age of 13, yeah, he was a very strong player, and this is a wonderful game, no doubt about it. But it was nothing as popular as it was when Fischer was trouncing the Soviets on his way to take the chess throne. Well, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. This again was Robert Byrne versus Robert Fischer, Rosenwald Memorial in New York, October 17th, 1956. I encourage all the viewers to get a chessboard, set it up, go over the game in a written format, and just go through this, because there's so many different things that can be played in this game. Different tactics that work for different reasons, and others that fail for certain reasons. So it's a good tactical exercise if you got the time or the inclination to dig into it. I strongly suggest that you do. Thank you, and from Tucson, wishing you good luck and good chess.